Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. As the US election in November becomes ever more unpredictable, on this episode I'm speaking to a writer that has just published a highly relevant book. A Ride Across America, a 4,000-mile adventure through the small towns and big issues of the USA is, as the title suggests, a book that's trying to uncover the realities of what's really going on in the country. The author, Simon Parker, did this by speaking to people who wouldn't normally have their voices heard, everyday people in everyday situations. He did this by cycling across America from top left near Seattle down to Key West in Florida. If that sounds like an unusual thing for a writer to do, I should explain that Simon is a travel writer who specialises in doing long-distance cycle rides. And on his latest one, he racked up over 4,000 miles and interviewed hundreds of people to find out what life is really like in the US in the 2020s. In our discussion, we talk about what drives Simon's interest in travel and writing about it, how the pandemic and becoming a father have impacted his work, why he loves doing long-distance bike rides, and how that helps his craft. You also hear about the challenges and incredible stories that he gathered on the way, so expect to hear about the cultural and social dynamics of the US, the kindness of strangers, and the unique perspective Simon gained on issues like gun control, religion, freedom of speech, and food deserts. And if that's a new term on you, don't worry, it's all explained. So, without further ado, here's my discussion with Simon Parker on cycling across America. Simon, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a great honor to be here.
I'm really excited to have you because you've done something that I think is insane and yet absolutely fascinating and written a book about it. Before we get on to that, can you just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am 37. I am British. I grew up in North Oxfordshire and I currently live on the edge of the Cotswolds, area of natural beauty. But I've spent the best part of the last 20 years traveling around the world, working as a travel writer and a foreign correspondent and a filmmaker, working for The Telegraph, for The Times, the BBC. I've made documentaries for Amazon Prime. And I've probably been to about 150 countries in the last couple of decades. And it was all I ever really wanted to do. All I wanted to do was travel. Travel was just a thing that I was just bursting to go out and do, having grown up in the countryside of North Oxfordshire. When I was 19, I set off and I bought a one-way ticket to New Zealand. And I spent a year hitchhiking around Australia and New Zealand with a tent and a fishing rod. And from there, I haven't really looked back, to be honest. I came back from that trip and I just said to myself, right, I want to try and make this my career somehow. So I studied creative writing and cinematics. And then from there, just sort of worked my way up through journalism and broadcasting, and now recently in publishing. And I just love going off around the world on these big adventures and telling different people's stories along the way.
Wow. Love that. And you reminded me of a sort of, as a child, I'd sit there in geography classes and kind of look at a map of the world. And I'm sure I was supposed to be listening about rock formations or something, but I would kind of look at the map. And I love the fact that you've taken that dream that I suspect all of us at some point have and just turned it into your life. Was the desire to travel, was there any particular reason? Is it curiosity? What is it about that? And at what point did you realize that as you were growing up?
I was never particularly academic as a child. I was, the real subtext is I was a very, very naughty teenager. I was lucky not to be suspended or expelled on multiple occasions for getting to all sorts of mischief and hijinks at school. But I was fascinated by things like maps and atlases from a young age. I was just obsessed by looking at all these little squiggles on the edges of maps and just thinking about what these places actually were and who might live there and what they might look like. And then obviously with the advent of something like Google Maps, I remember sort of, 15, 20 years ago when people first started playing around on Google Maps, that was just such an unbelievable adventure to have in the comfort of your own home. One of my favorite things to do would be to just zoom in on these tiny little islands in the middle of the Pacific, looking at what they were called and their history and stuff like that. I just find stuff like that absolutely fascinating. So where did this really come from? I think really looking back to my teenage years, a lot of it came from just feeling quite quite bored of being stuck in one place, to be honest. There's a strange moment when you're probably about sort of 14 to 16, 17, where you can't really go out. You can't really go clubbing or to sort of to pubs, although I did do plenty of that. You can't drive. You can't leave school. You can't quite go backpacking. And I remember this time was just this period of quite big frustration in terms of really wanting to just crack on with my adult life. So when I reached the age of 18, 19, I just saved up whatever I could. I worked part-time in my local shop and I just had enough money. I got enough money to buy a one-way ticket and it allowed me to go and travel around the world. When I was growing up, my parents could never really afford to go on particularly extravagant holidays. We went to Spain a couple of times. That was basically it. And I went on a school trip to France. But I was always very aware that there was an enormous world out there that needed exploring, really. And I've always just wanted to be one of those people who experiences things firsthand. I don't really want to just live life as an armchair traveler, although that is now my audience. I want to go out there and be that person who's doing that themselves.
And how was the pandemic for you? Because I'm somebody that any excuse to travel somewhere ideally paid for by someone else, and I'll take it. I went a bit stir crazy. The lockdown for me was as much about not being able to leave the country as it was about not being able to leave your house and go and do normal things. I'm assuming, given what you do in your passion, that must have been really challenging.
Well, it was, yeah, it was very, very challenging. And I wrote extensively about this in my first book, Riding Out. And basically, the whole premise of Riding Out is at the beginning of the pandemic, my life just essentially fell apart. I suffered a couple of quite close bereavements in my life. As a travel writer, being unable to travel means you're unable to write. And it means that essentially overnight, my career just went up in a puff of smoke. So I had to find a way of trying to deal with that and come to terms with the grief I was feeling towards that loss of that lifestyle I had before. So I actually dreamt up this crazy idea of cycling around the edge of Britain. And I ended up cycling 3,500 miles from the very northernmost point of Britain all the way down to the very south, and then all the way back up to the top again. I went from the top of Shetland to the bottom of the Isles of Scilly, and I passed through 55 UK counties. And from that trip, I think I've really just tried to cement this sort of brand, I guess, as a journalist of wanting to go off on these long form journeys, these very big adventures, which bring people in just because they're interested in travel. But then at the same time, use those adventures as an opportunity to meet hundreds and hundreds of fascinating people. Because actually, as a journalist, as an author, I think that without that, these travel narratives can get a bit bland. They can get a bit samey. I've read books about, especially solo male adventurers going off and conquering the great outdoors. And I think there's probably enough of that out there. Whereas my background is as a journalist, as a broadcaster. So it's about trying to uncover those stories in the flesh on the ground, which I'm really, really fascinated in, which I managed to achieve reasonably well, I hope, with my first book, Riding Out. And then with my second book, which has just come out, A Ride Across America.
Talk to us about the cycling, because that's obviously a passion. If you're going to do cycling on that scale, you have to love it. What is it about cycling that grabs you?
I think cycling is the perfect pace of travel for me. I find that being in a car or a train or a plane is far too fast. It feels like I'm whizzing through a place at a speed which doesn't allow me to properly perceive it, properly sort of appreciate where I am. Similarly, I've done a lot of long distance walking expeditions, and I actually find that walking is probably a little bit too slow for me because, you can be in the mountains and you can essentially see where you're going to be walking in the next 2 or 3 hours. Often, the vista sort of spans out ahead of you and you can almost sort of predict what it's going to be like in a couple of hours' time. The great joy of being on a bicycle, a heavily loaded touring bike, is that, in a day you can cycle 80, 90, 100 miles, which is a pretty decent distance to try and cover. I also love the fact that cycling and being on a heavily loaded touring bike with panniers and a flag and a trailer, it is an icebreaker like no other thing. I think if you're perhaps just walking around, hiking from place to place with a backpack, people are a little bit more standoffish. There's something sort of people sort of a bit more wary of someone just with a backpack. There's something about being on a bicycle, which people think that you've really sort of thought it through a little bit better. And what I'm trying to do as a journalist, like a cycling, or what I should say is a journalist who cycles, it really allows me to, break the ice with complete strangers and try and sort of get these really candid and honest opinions about life or about politics, about culture. So yeah, that's basically sort of the sort of market I'm trying to corner with my books.
And I love that idea of what I might term as planned lunacy, right? So walking, I guess you could do it by mistake. Whereas I love this idea that you've had to, clearly, a bicycle doesn't just appear. You've got to have transported it there. You need the equipment. You need the know-how to do that. And I think that's really interesting because I would have thought walking would make one more approachable because that's what many of the people that you're encountering will be walking. But there's something really interesting about as a vehicle and as an icebreaker and the fact that I guess people you're obviously on a longer journey, so it's a fascinating human dynamic for me that opens people up because but it doesn't seem at all logical, and yet on an emotional, visceral level, I can kind of see what you're saying.
Well, because it's quite a madcap thing for people to be doing. And in a lot of these big, extensive, multi-thousand-mile journeys that I do on my bike, it just blows people's mind. The idea that you might be traveling, 3 or 4 thousand miles on a bicycle. I've done these trips many, many times now, and I guess I've sort of normalized it to a certain extent. 4 or 5 thousand mile bike ride over the course of 10 or 12 weeks is something I've done a lot. So I have to remind myself to be too blasé about this because it is still quite a cool thing. And actually, I'm reminded of that when I bump into complete strangers and they look at my bike and they study my panniers and they're really curious about what I'm carrying, what I'm not carrying, the places I've slept, the things I've eaten. And then when you get into the sort of nuts and the bolts of how far you're actually traveling, it really does blow people's minds because you're traveling a distance which some people would fly or take a train or, travel at 100 miles per hour in a vehicle. Um, I don't think I'll ever get bored of that special moment when you see this realization on people's faces that actually you're not taking them for a ride. You're not pulling a fast one. You're not making this up. There's this moment where they're like, is this guy a phony? Actually, no, he is actually doing this thing. And then the coolest thing is then they might sort of check you out online or something. And then a couple of hours, they might be sending you a message on Instagram or Facebook or something like that. And it really does capture people's imaginations. It really, really does. And what I find is that, yes, 99% of the population would never do this themselves. It's too crazy. It's too risky. And yes, it is. But I would say 100% of the population think, great, go for it. There's something about just this sense of freedom, this idea of adventure that perhaps, yeah, you might not do it yourself, but great, someone else wants to do it. This is fascinating.
There's something really interesting about you're doing it because you can, right? And the way you write and the way you talk about it, there's just this sense of, well, it's almost like it's an option, so I'm going to do it.
Well, yeah, I think I this sounds quite nihilistic, but I think about death daily. I think about how short my life is going to be and the finite amount of years I have on this planet. And I think I've written about this before, especially in my first book about dealing with grief or perhaps not dealing with it properly, losing friends, losing people my age who never got the opportunity to live a full life. And I just think if you can go each day, if it's not always easy, yes, you do get caught up in the humdrum of sort of a so-called normal life. But at the same time, if you can just routinely remind yourself that every single day that we have is an amazing privilege. And one day in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, goodness knows when it might be, this will all be over. Life can just become a lot more of a liberating experience. Similarly, I'm not religious. I'm an atheist. I don't feel like anything's going to happen to me when my life comes to an end. So I want to try and make the most of these big things. And people say, cycling across America, it's crazy. Sailing across the Pacific, it's crazy. So, hiking to the top of the Andes. Why would you do that? Well, why would you not do it? Basically, that's my principle. And, we're all entitled to live our lives however we want. And, these madcap adventures really sort of genuinely make me feel like I'm genuinely living my life rather than just sort of surviving it.
And does that, when you're not doing it, does boredom kick in?
To a certain extent, but I have learned to manage that a bit better because it's not sustainable or healthy for me to only ever think that being at the top of a mountain or being thrown around in the middle of the Pacific is the only fulfilling way of living my life, basically. So, for example, I'm now married, I have a young daughter, and that is my next big adventure, essentially. Of course, I'm a travel writer, I'm an author, I'm a broadcaster. I will have to fit in time within my calendar to go off on these massive adventures. But at the same time, whereas perhaps 10 years ago, before I met my wife, I was doing 40 or 50 trips a year, constantly away, living out of a suitcase, just spending all my time on planes or in departure lounges or anything like that. I've realized that actually I took it to one extreme a little bit too far. So what I'm trying to do now is go off on, let's say, one or two really, really big and proper expeditions a year so that I'm away for, let's say, 6 to 10 weeks at a time, rather than all the coming and the going. Because actually, when you have a family, that's the really disruptive thing. It's the never really feeling like you're in one place. It's all the, can you give me a lift to Heathrow? It's the night before you leave and the spare rooms covered in suitcases and stuff like that. And then you do all the goodbyes and then you're back in 10 days time. What we're trying to do now is create a life around my career in which I'll go away and do a big expedition for a book or hopefully a TV show or something like that. And we just do it all in one go. And then I'm back for the next 10 months writing the book, living some sort of normal lifestyle, but I still get to sort of scratch that itch of needing to go off on these big adventures.
And let's talk about the latest one in the book. And I love that it's top left to bottom right of the US. Tell us about how that came about.
Yeah, so I mean, my new book, A Ride Across America, a 4,000-mile adventure through the small towns and big issues of the USA. This only came out last week. However, this book has kind of been in the making since 2016. So in 2016, I managed to get commissioned by the BBC to sail and cycle halfway around the world. I sailed across the Pacific, cycled across America, sailed across the Atlantic, and then cycled back through Europe. It took 133 days to travel 15,000 miles. And this became my sort of first real big, meaty expedition for a major broadcaster. So this became a documentary for the BBC World Service. Ever since that ride, it'd be across America in the build-up to the 2016 election, the year in which Trump was elected, kind of been playing on the back of my mind, just saying, it's an amazing way of sort of really taking the temperature of the country and really getting an idea as to how people are feeling on the ground and trying to uncover stories which just aren't normally uncovered. So, yeah, I decided to get back there less than a year ago to try and meet hundreds of people again, but really properly record those interviews and then turn it into this new book, which is out now in the build up to this November's presidential election. And the whole idea is to just try and give people an insight into all of those big talking points that have always been part of American culture and will continue to be part of American culture, either in the lead up to this election or another one. So those big sort of culture wars, the things like, climate change and gun ownership and sort of Roe versus Wade. But rather than just sort of trusting the same intellectuals and journalists and newspaper columnists and talking heads, what I wanted to try and do was get out there and try and uncover voices from people who would just never normally have their voices heard. So, farmers, fishermen, artists, museums, people I just met randomly on the on the roadside. And yeah, my new book is it's stuffed with them, dozens upon dozens, if not hundreds of different interviews with just fascinating people giving me their opinions on why America is this way, basically. And then in sort of bringing that all together, the skeleton of that book is this 4,500-mile journey across America on my bike and all of the thrills and the spills associated with that.
And one of the themes that comes across, and it doesn't surprise me, and yet it does, is the sense of kindness. Given what you're doing, you are often reliant on strangers for help or sometimes assistance you might not want. But it really struck me that what you pull out is people are, even in a world where we think of sort of danger and risk and other people pose a threat to us, and of course that is true, there's this sense of tremendous kindness from lots of people, many of whom don't have anything and yet seem to welcome you into their homes, give you things, support you and engage with you. And it really struck me that in amongst it all, the sense of humanity really comes out.
Yeah, and I think travel will always remind us of that. I do a lot of lectures and talks at schools and universities all over the world. And that's one thing I try and remind sort of young adults before they've gone off and had these big expeditions themselves, that in my opinion, the world is ultimately a good place. Yes, there are people who are perhaps, I don't know, have, you know, internal issues. They're in a state of socioeconomic desperation. But ultimately, I really don't believe that there are many very, very bad people in this world. And actually, I think going off and having these adventures, meeting people and getting out of your little bubble, wherever it may be, your town, your city, your family unit, will restore your faith in humanity in terms of realizing that the world probably isn't as dangerous and as horrible as sometimes we're led to believe by the media. You know, I've been part of this industry for 20 years and I've kind of got to a point now that by writing books, this is now a natural progression in the sort of career I want to have. Because the issue is with a 1,000-word newspaper article or a 3-minute piece on the news, the way those things are put together is they just try and basically create these two quite polarized opinions in order, it's kind of in the guise of balance, but ultimately it's not really balance. It's just it can create this idea that the world is very, very divided. And that is how America in particular is often meant to look from a distance. What I found, however, is that when you go and have real life conversations with people, you sit down on the roadside, you have a coffee or a beer. I think actually people have a lot more in common than they actually have apart. And that was kind of the premise which I set out for this book. And yeah, of course, there's the occasional anomaly. But every time I go off and have these big expeditions and I meet hundreds of people that I've never met before and I'll probably never meet again, it really does restore my faith in the world that we live in, that it is ultimately a good place.
And there are themes that come up in the book, some of which didn't surprise me at all. So guns is an obvious example in the big topic in the US. But there were other things that really surprised me. And one of the things that I was very surprised by was the prevalence of the theme of books and bookstores, and you talk about book banning. Were you looking for that, or did that just appear naturally as a theme? Because it made perfect sense to me, and yet I was surprised that it had the prominence it had.
I'm not sure if I particularly went out looking for it, but I did know that as a journalist and as a reader, I have an interest in American literature. So, you know, Steinbeck in particular, or Kerouac, these seminal depictions of America at a particular time in its history. So I did, to a certain extent, want to cycle across America with those depictions in the back of my mind, because what I'm always quite interested in as an author is that kind of contrast between the way a country is sometimes portrayed in film or on the page and how it is actually in the flesh. So that was something I really wanted to keep in mind. I've always found as well that just bookshops or libraries are just great places to meet really quite open-minded people. You know, books are, without generalizing too much, people who read books are open-minded people. They are prepared to have their biases challenged. So yeah, on two or three occasions, I went into bookshops and started chatting to the owners, and they gave me some brilliant perspectives on the country they were living in. One in particular springs to mind in Montana. There's this. I was in this tiny little town in Montana on the side of the interstate, and there was this unbelievably cool secondhand bookshop. I went in there and had this really fascinating conversation with the owner. And she described how she was actually really right wing. She was very pro guns. She was a Republican Trump supporter. And I mean, some people would sort of jump to conclusions and say that actually she would be quite a close minded person. But actually, she was saying, like, these are just my opinions. But actually, the power of books is even more important than that. And while I have these opinions, I have absolutely no problem with other people having other opinions. And that was something which I wanted to explore throughout this book, in terms of the fact that I want to try and sort of live in a world where people are prepared to disagree with each other. It's okay to have a different opinion to someone. It's not the end of the world. And actually, again, by not trusting social media algorithms or rolling news channels and just having conversations with people in bookshops, in cafes, in pubs and bars, actually you realize that we're a lot more similar, I think, in terms of our sort of outlook on politics and culture and history.
And there's a lovely anecdote around banning of books. And I thought it was a really clever technique that a librarian had used to make that less likely. Can you talk about that? Because I thought it was a fascinating illustration of thinking smartly about how we can persuade people to be more open-minded.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is, I think the bit that you're referring to is I was in a place called Ritzville, and Ritzville is a small town in Washington. Small town Washington is traditionally a very sort of Republican voting sort of place. It's very agricultural. You're more likely to find sort of red voting areas than you are blue. And I got speaking to the librarian, Heather, and she told me that book banning was really, really, really popular in some of the particularly right-wing places. So over half of all the book bans in the 2022-2023 academic year occurred in Florida, Texas, Missouri, and Utah, which is essentially indicative of their political and religious stances, and particularly the governor. But I might just read this section because this sort of explains it quite nicely. In Washington, meanwhile, Heather and her fellow librarians had adopted a procedure known as the line of defense, which required anyone wishing to ban a book to first fill in a form. It was a less knee-jerk approach, which resulted in fewer bans. She said, people then meet and discuss it, and we try to make it difficult for people to ban books. Heather was keen to stress that she and her fellow librarians still followed a code of ethics. She told me, technically, as a librarian, we are supposed to make everything available to everybody. If a kid says they want to check out 50 Shades of Grey, then I can't say, no, you can't check that out. But what I can do as a librarian and as an adult is to help sway them in the right direction towards something that is age appropriate. So yeah, that's kind of the approach that she was taking there, which was a sort of, yeah, she described it as that line of defense to allow, to not fall down the idea of book banning, because actually book banning has become one of those quite significant culture wars in the US, whereby some people are trying to stop children, but in some cases other people, from reading a book just because they don't agree with it. Which, your more liberal-minded librarian would suggest is quite a slippery slope.
And I think that's a really good illustration of the kind of conversations that you're unlocking. I'm intrigued. How do you start these conversations? And I think part of the answer, I suspect, is because it's America and people are more willing to talk. I was just thinking, if you were to do it in certain other countries, getting to that level of trust, I guess, for want of a better phrase, it would be quite challenging. How did you go about starting those sorts of conversations? Because I love the anecdotes that you get, but there's an art to feeding those conversations.
I guess first and foremost, you have the US Constitution. And the US Constitution is sort of an ingrained and historic right to free speech. So I think it's off the top of my head, it's the first or the Second Amendment. And it basically says, you can say what you want, you can question authority, you can have an opinion on pretty much anything, which is quite unique, actually, to the US. So as a journalist, I've worked and I've broadcast in over 100 countries for the BBC, the Telegraph, etc. You go to some countries and people are very, very hesitant to give you an opinion. They're very wary of questioning authority. In the US, that doesn't really seem to exist. So you already have a head start in that environment because that is hardwired into the sort of collective American psyche. Secondly, I have the bicycle. People see my bike and they're intrigued by it. So very, very often people are feeling sort of magnetized towards me in the first place, rather than me just doorstepping people and putting pressure on them originally. People are coming to me because they're fascinated by it. Third sort of thing that helps me is a British English accent. If you're in Nebraska or Kansas, you stick out like a sore thumb in a really, really good way. Americans are traditionally extremely friendly, very generous, very hospitable, and they just love having a chat and they're fascinated by Britain and they love British people in general. So very, very often, all of those things are conspiring to actually sort of give me a massive, massive leg up. What I generally try to do is I try to let conversations just start naturally because, on a human level, I'm not recording anyone secretly or anything like that. I have an obligation to my craft, to my book, and to the person who I'm speaking to, that they know who I am and what I'm doing. So after a few minutes, I might explain, oh, actually, I'm cycling across America. I'm an author, I'm a travel writer, and I'm getting different opinions from Americans about the state of America. Would you like to tell me, would you like to answer a few questions? And you know what? Not a single person said no. Of the
Wow.
hundreds and hundreds of conversations I had across the US, not a single person told me to get lost. And that is incredibly unique. You wouldn't get that in any other country. And and I think if you just follow that, if you were to just randomly knock on someone's door and say, hey, I'm a journalist, tell me about so-and-so, you might get a different way, but there is just a way of gradually going about these things. It's a sort of softly approach, where you try and uncover the best stuff. And then as a journalist, as an interviewer, as a human being, as a sort of conversationalist, it's then my skill, my craft of trying to uncover those little nuggets of information, that bring out these really cool and fascinating anecdotes, hopefully.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In many cases in the book, there were things that surprised me but didn't surprise me. And one of those was this idea of food deserts. And we know that the American diet is not, the portion size, the sort of food that's eaten, the classic stereotypical stuff. It's not healthy. But I thought it was just a problem of, people aren't choosing to have healthy options. The point that you unpicked for me in the book was the idea that many people don't have that choice, that fresh food or fresh fruit, that sort of thing, is not available. It's not even a case of some people don't have the money, but it's just not physically available for them.
No, yeah, these food deserts in the US are a real and significant thing. There are, I think, off the top of my head, about 75 counties, which are pretty vast areas in the US, which do not have access to a grocery store. So, and this is something which you really sort of see when you're on a bicycle and you're moving very slowly. Yeah, you're trying to get all of your food from a, convenience store, which just sells heavily processed, long shelf life foods, or in a gas station, which is generally the same sort of stuff. It's sort of sweets, it's calorific drinks, it's, popcorn, hot dogs, fried chicken. It is impossible to find any fresh food. As someone who was trying to cycle across America, this was a challenge, because actually you learn that you're like a machine, essentially. And if you put in bad fuel, you get a bad return, essentially. If you try and eat good things, you're getting your proteins, you're getting your fresh vegetables, you're getting your fiber, you cycle better, you feel better, you sleep better. many people in the US, millions of people who are living in these food deserts, are having to face that on a daily basis because that access to fresh food simply doesn't exist. And these are those little things that I wanted to try and uncover, because it's very easy to look across at the United States and think like it's this sort of land of milk and honey, but it's not. It has, for all of the successes of the US, for all the sort of social mobility of the American dream, there are millions and millions of people living in quite significant levels of poverty. And if you just travel through the US on a road trip in a car, or if you just go to Los Angeles or Disneyland or New York for a long weekend, these things can pass you by. But what I wanted to try and prove with this book is that it's in the hinterlands of America, where it is much more diverse. The problems are a lot more acute. And yeah, it's not that sort of polished, perfect, greatest country on the planet, which many Americans perceive it to be, but many people around the world see it as too.
And given the scale of what you were doing, I imagine were there stretches where you just got bored, for want of a better phrase, right? It's just monotonous landscapes or things. Or was it we because of the cycling, were you always kind of, I guess, aware of your surroundings, and therefore because you were having to pay attention, right? Because otherwise bad things could happen.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I ever really get bored on these trips. What you're always trying to do is sort of, because, let's say, for example, in the back of my mind, I'm always thinking about how this is going to play out on paper. So actually, across a 400-page book, 120,000 words, whatever it is, you need to have those sorts of peaks and troughs. It's actually okay to have a day or two where not much happens, because you need that time to sort of allow the reader to rest a little bit. And actually, you're doing that as the rider at the time. You're having that moment to think. So, for example, what I quite like about this format is I might be in a place, I might be having this really full-on conversation about gun ownership with a farmer on the side of the road or whatever. But actually, if I was to give someone a conversation straight after that about something equally as hard hitting, you can actually wear yourself out as the writer, and you can wear the reader out. You need to have that sort of meandering narrative throughout. So that, when those slow days did come along, actually, it was quite nice to just try and switch off for a few hours and just say, right, yes, I'm a journalist. Yes, I'm here to make a book. But at the same time, it's like what I was on about earlier about trying to appreciate the most of your life, is that these are still hours in my life. This is still a day just like any other. And if I'm cycling through dozens and dozens of miles of never-ending cornfields in Nebraska, actually being able to appreciate the sheer scale of that is what makes a journey like this so special. And it's actually, it's adding that context of, I cycled for hour upon hour upon hour and nothing much changed. That tells a story in its own right.
And I think that's a really interesting counterweight to some of if I look at sort of Instagram travel, where people are it's heightened sense of, got to have a picture here, then and everything is driven around those, getting as much out of it as you can. And I love this idea of, I guess, slow travel, really, where you're enjoying the moment and being in the moment. And so that's a mental respite for you, I guess, so that you can process some of the experiences, so that you can the memories become a bit sharper. You've got time to think in a way that I think we're often encouraged to just sort of, go for a weekend, almost like ironically, the way some Americans travel in Europe, right? Blitz around because they don't have much time, blitz around the continent as quickly as possible. What you're doing is giving yourself an opportunity, I guess, to reflect on what you've seen and to pull it all together, and for it not all to be the highs, in a way that I think we're often encouraged to do.
Well, yeah. And the thing is that, for most people, Americans especially, who get 2 weeks of vacation a year, and for many people who are going to go on holiday, I get it. I've been there. You've got a week off. You want to go and see and do as much as you possibly can. And if that means you go on a trip to Europe and it means you're only going to get a day in Paris, a day in Rome, a day in London, and a day in Madrid, then that is just the way, for most people, that's how they're going to have to do it. I'm in this quite sort of privileged place as a journalist, is that I can go off on these 10-week journeys. And actually, I need that length of time to fill 350 or 400 pages. I need that time to create the content. Slow travel, I've written extensively about slow travel over the years, for the Telegraph mostly. And just, that's how I want, that's the sort of travel I want to do. And actually, as a journalist, as a travel writer, I think I want to try and encourage that as well because it's more sustainable. The idea of just, flying to Paris for 2 days. Yeah, great. I'm not for one moment criticizing it, but I think probably what's going to happen in the next few decades, as hopefully people start to travel a bit more responsibly, will be going on fewer but more significant trips, basically, because I personally, from experience, I think they're a lot more rewarding.
When you set off on these sorts of journeys, is there any point where you think I'm not going to be able to write the book, but an equivalent of writer's block, I guess, or does it just you just know it's going to flow? Or is the scale of the adventure such that you will have enough content? Is there any point where you worried that I don't know there might not be anything to write about?
Not really, no. I mean, I guess the hardest thing is just staring at a blank page at the beginning, getting back from one of these trips with hundreds of hours of recordings, notes, photos, and just trying to calm your brain down to know that you've got to try and boil this down into something that makes sense. But that's the job. That's what I've been doing as a journalist. That is my craft, I hope. Um, from when I got back from this journey, no, I was very, very comfortable. I had more than enough content. What I say at the beginning of the book is, I've had to I've had to trim down all of these conversations in the interest of brevity, just to try and cut out all of the best bits. So you're doing an editing job as well, because actually you can't just record it. You just can't include everything verbatim. It would just be a never ending book. Um, so yeah, I've kind of always feel like I've got enough stuff. The real challenge with this book was getting it done in time. So I it took me 2.5 months to cycle across America in the end of summer last year. I got back in November, and then I basically just locked myself away for 4 months, writing 1,500 words a day, 5 or 6 days a week, until it was done, essentially. And rather than just submitting one manuscript at the end to my publisher, I was submitting sort of 30 or 40,000 words at a time, so that they could be working on the edit while I was still working on the next chapters, which basically sort of expedited the whole thing. Because the whole premise and the whole idea of this book all along was to create the most up-to-date and topical depiction of the United States right now. So, it's people talking about all of those big topics that people are talking about right now. But I've managed to get that verbatim, that really sort of on the ground sort of material. I'm not sure if there's anyone else out there, I don't know, a documentary or anything who's been doing something similar to me, but I don't think there's anyone with this sort of current material, which is about to hit, or which had just hit bookshops in the lead up to this presidential election. And then even in light of the events that have happened in the last few days, actually the book isn't remotely out of date, because actually there are these topics which are just ever present in American culture.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I found it fascinating because you reading it, I was starting to draw threads. What I see on the news and the politics, you can start to understand some of the drivers of what's going on there. So for me, it was a real, as you said, I haven't come across anything in this level of detail, or I guess with that many sort of anecdotes and real life stories, because you get you get the economic data that will tell one story. And what I loved about this is you're bringing anecdotes to the data, which can help us to understand what's going on. And so for me, it's a much clearer vision of sort of, what is driving some of these forces that play out on our news screens.
Well, exactly, because it's very easy to watch the news and feel really detached from it. It's this data, it's these statistics, it's these talking heads. But actually, all of this big data is representative of human beings and their behaviors, basically. I had I spoke to a newspaper journalist in this book for he works a newspaper in Montana, and he kind of he said exactly that. Basically, all of the big issues that you see on the news channels, in the Washington Post and the Guardian, these things are happening at a very, very tiny human level right here. And I think sometimes it can be easy to just think that all of these macro global issues and talking points that we have, ultimately, they're these tiny micro decisions and opinions that 8 billion people are having around the world. So actually, yeah, what this book is aiming to do is it's bringing in those big macro discussion points, but it's trying to illustrate them with so-called normal people who would never normally have their opinions heard, who are perfectly adequate at illustrating those big issues.
And was there anything in the conversations that you had that changed your mind on something? Because obviously you'll have come with your own views on whether that's gun control or political perspectives or just views on life. Was there anything in these conversations that you found yourself shifting your position on as a result of, just talking about it to people?
Well, I mean, I would say that one of the biggest thinking points for me was gun ownership. You know, I'm a British person. I enjoy living in a country where we have very few guns, and by proxy, we have very few gun crimes. Whereas in the United States, dozens of people a day are being killed by gun crime. So what I do try and do throughout this book is, yes, when I walk into a polling booth, I will make a decision upon what I want politically. But what I try and do within this book and with all my journalism generally is to try and be as objective and as non-political as possible. What I would say, though, is one kind of major realization that I made by cycling across America and speaking to so many people, and this idea of sort of gun ownership always cropping up, speaking to people from a very liberal mindset or a very conservative mindset. I do feel like the United States is down such a deep, deep path of gun ownership that honestly and sort of realistically, I don't think there'll ever be a way for them to backtrack from that. There are millions of guns in circulation in the United States. You see them. There are, people carrying either open carry, concealed carry. I saw people with guns hanging out the back of their jeans, people who are probably what I'm imagining are illegal firearms. And I think one of the major realizations I come to is that, if in some crazy situation I was to live in the United States with my young family, it surprised me, but I would probably come to the realization that I think I would probably have to carry a gun, because if everyone else is carrying a gun, what do you do? And it's taken many, many trips to the United States for me to come to that realization. It may change, I'm not sure, but I remember coming back from this trip thinking, if people talk about guns as being sort of, equalizers essentially, and I don't want to live in a country with guns, but if you're in a room and everyone's got a gun and you haven't, what do you do? And I can't quite get my head around what the answer to that is, other than if you can't beat them, join them.
And as you're talking, I was thinking, well, that's the argument. But in the UK, well, that's the argument kids use for knives. That's why we have this problem. Is every other kid? If I perceive every other kid has a knife, so there's something really. It's an unusual case in the sense of what guns can do is extreme. There are the scale and the number of them that are out there that are there, but it's that same fundamental human dynamic, which brings us back to your earlier point around we're all the same, right? There's a lot of the commonality of issues. They just present themselves slightly differently in different cultures.
Well, yeah, because actually there's always going to be this difference between how you might feel ideologically about particular issues in the world, in your life, politically, and how that opinion may change if and when it's forced to change, basically. And I think a lot of people in the US would say the same thing. They would say, I really wish I didn't have to carry a gun. I never, ever want to use this gun. It would change my life forever if I had to use this gun and I had to potentially, defend myself and maybe even kill someone. It would change my life forever. And I don't want that to happen. However, I feel like it's my only choice, because if someone walks in here and tries to, take something from me or, harm someone I love, what else can I do, basically? And I'm still struggling to sort of come to terms with that myself, to be honest. It's just such a complicated issue. And as a Briton, it's even harder to get my head around because I didn't grow up in that environment.
And I guess the other thing, while we're on sort of strongly held views, is religion. And one of the points that you make when you've talked about it on the show, your own beliefs. How are conversations about that? Because I could imagine that feels like a very thorny subject to get into, and therefore it's something. For example, if I go to the US, I'm very careful. I don't mind talking about gun control, having that discussion. I would probably steer clear of religion. Was that something you were conscious of? Was that a difficult topic to talk about?
So naturally, I do stay clear of religion. It's just, naturally I do, and naturally I did. However, in the US, especially on a big journey like this, it can be inescapable, really, because you find people very, very often, American Christians especially, asking you questions like, where's your church, or things like that. And thought long and hard about how I sort of approached this sort of thing. And I just thought I have to be honest. And if someone says to me, if someone starts reciting biblical scripture at me or asks me about the second coming of Christ or whatever it might be, I can only be polite and I can only be myself and just say, personally, that's just not something I believe. But, great, go for it. I'm not an anti-theist. I just choose not to personally believe in a deity. But if other people do choose to do that, great. Everyone's living their life in a different way. But yeah, I did come up against some people who did hold particularly strong views about the state of the world and how that was linked to, sin and what was going to happen. I met a Christian pastor quite early in my trip who said that he was expecting the Great Tribulation, I think it was called, and it's basically the start of the end of days, and that there are millions of people in America who are believing something very similar, that the world is starting to come to an end, and there will be the second coming of Christ. It can be very easy in the UK to sort of just go through your life and never actually be, you never come into contact with these sorts of opinions. But in the US, Christianity especially is heavily rooted in American culture.
And having done that adventure, what's next on your list?
Well, good question. If this book does well, I would love to get back to the US. I think as a journalist, there is just an untapped sort of never-ending supply of fascinating people. It's like what I was getting at about being able to interview Americans and talk to Americans candidly about life and the country they live in and their history, which it's just a wonderful place to do journalism. So if this book does well, I'd like to get back to America and do another one, do a follow-up. If not, I'm working on a novel now. So I might try and branch out into fiction. If not, I would like to go off and do another big overland journey. What I'm trying to do, though, you're always trying to find something which is going to have the biggest possible audience, because yes, it would be nice to go off and do, I don't know, a bike ride across, I don't know, insert random country. But I need to think that if I'm going to spend a year creating something, it's going to have the best possible chance of reaching the biggest possible audience. Hopefully, with what I do, is that there is a really quite topical and journalistic angle to my work. Because I think that we're reaching the days of travel writing in which just traveling for travel's sake is getting harder and harder for people to commission. There has to be an angle. Why are you going off to do it? So I think from a professional perspective, what I just want to try and do is really try and cement this position that I've got as this sort of hopefully quite credible journalist who's going off on these big, exciting adventures, but at the same time, uncovering fascinating things at the same time. So that's what I want to try and do. The next thing for me is really, I'm about to go on tour. So the book has just come out, but then September, October, I'm doing a big UK theatre tour. And in conjunction with my book, people will be coming to see me at theatres all over the country. You can find the dates on my website. And basically over the course of a couple of hours, I'll be looking back at maps, photos, short films. I'll do a question and answer session. I'll be signing books so that people who've read the book or perhaps will read the book in the future can really get stuck into the subject and come to one of my live shows.
Fascinating. I think, Simon, that is a fabulous note on which to end. You said if this book does well. I'm going to say when this book does well, because it's an absolutely cracking read. And what I thought was fascinating is I want to read it again, partly having spoken to you, but also I just think there were so many stories in there that made me think and sort of changed my perspective on what we're explaining things. And I think as we see this election campaign unfolding, this is the perfect book to have a little bit more of an understanding, a peek behind it, and almost get away from the sensationalist stuff and actually discover what some real people are thinking who are living real lives in, outside the bubble.
Well, it's incredibly refreshing that that's how you perceived it, because actually, as an author, it's a really quite stressful and worrying situation when you spend such a protracted period of your life creating something with this idea in your mind that's what you want to do. But thankfully, the way you've just described the book back to me, and thankfully the way other people have been just reading the book and describing it back to me, is basically exactly what I wanted to achieve. So, if all else fails, I feel slightly sort of vindicated that this was a good idea, and I put myself through quite significant levels of discomfort to achieve this book, and hopefully it'll find an audience.
Fabulous. Well, listen, thank you for writing it and going through that. I'm sure you enjoyed it in parts, but I'm also sure it was a heck of a lot of work, both to do the journey, but also to write it. But above all, thank you so much for being a fabulous guest on the show. I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you.
Thanks for having me.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to Simon for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Simon, including his books Riding Out and A Ride Across America, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there and to the book tour that he mentioned. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you enjoyed the show, please do leave a review. It really helps others to find the show and for me to continue to attract high-quality guests like Simon. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the website humanriskpodcast.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the show, but in the meantime, stay safe. Maybe think about slower, more immersive journeys for your next travel adventure. And thank you so much for listening.